This is TWiT.
Windows XP, Leo, and I said that correctly. Not Windows 8, not Windows 7. Windows XP was patched last week.
I know.
For the second Tuesday of May.
Well, maybe
XP,
more accurately to say a patch was offered because it wasn't automatic.
Correct. So you know something is worrying Microsoft deeply when they're willing to reach back to Windows XP and produce. I mean, they don't even want to keep 7 current. You know, like for the Spectrum Meltdown stuff, we don't have even now complete updates for all versions of Windows 7 for that because, you know, there's a strong push, as we know. I've now twice had the warning come up that all security for Windows 7 is being discontinued. So we want to help you get your ducks in a row to move to Windows 10 before February of next year. And it's like, okay, well, my ducks are fine. Thank you very much. We'll see what happens. Anyway, so this is XP. Simon Pope, the director of incident response with the Microsoft Security Response Center, the MSRC, titled his announcement posting as a plea with the headline, "Prevent a Worm by Updating Remote Desktop Services." He said, today, Microsoft released fixes for a critical remote code execution vulnerability. It was given CVE number 2019-0708 in remote desktop services, formerly known as terminal services, that affects some older versions of Windows. And their announcement says the remote desktop protocol, which of course we talk about often, RDP itself, he says, is not vulnerable. Okay, well, that's sort of a technicality. He says this vulnerability is pre-authentication and requires no user interaction. In other words, the vulnerability is wormable, meaning that any future malware that exploits this vulnerability could propagate from vulnerable computer to vulnerable computer in a similar way as the WannaCry malware spread across the globe in 2017. While we have observed no exploitation of this vulnerability, this is Microsoft saying, it is highly likely that malicious actors will write an exploit for this vulnerability and incorporate it into their malware. And now I have to say that I love the fact that the world is finally sitting up and taking sober responsibility for these sorts of problems. We know that anyone can make a mistake and that such mistakes can go unseen for years, as indeed this one did, because it existed in Windows XP from day one, and sometimes even for decades. So it's not the fact of the mistake that matters. It's how those who are responsible for fixing it deal with that responsibility. So this is, I have to say, another bravo for Microsoft. You know, on the other hand, they didn't really have much choice. Simon continues his posting saying, now that I have your attention, it is important that affected systems are patched as quickly as possible to prevent such a scenario from happening. In response, we are taking the unusual step of providing a security update for all customers to protect Windows platforms, including some out-of-support versions of Windows. He says vulnerable in-support systems, meaning those that are still receiving updates, include Windows 7, Windows Server 2008 R2, and Windows Server 2008. But that means specifically Windows 8, 8.1, and 10 are not vulnerable to this. So this is older versions of Windows. He said downloads for in-support versions of Windows can be found in the Microsoft Security Update Guide. Customers who use an in-support version of Windows and have automatic updates enabled are automatically protected. So, Leo, as you said, if you're in support and have auto updates, you'll be automatically protected. But unfortunately, earlier versions, out-of-support systems, he says, include Windows 2003 and Windows XP. If you are on an out-of-support version, the best way to address this vulnerability is to upgrade to the latest version of Windows. On the other hand, if you're running XP, maybe you'll have like 2 gig of RAM, and
good luck.
Sorry,
yeah,
yeah. He says, even so, we are making fixes available for these out-of-support versions of Windows, and then there's a KB for anyone who's listening, KB 4500705. So if you have XP, but it's worth saying, okay. So we'll cover this in a little more detail about what this means in a second. But I was just going to say that you'd have to be exposed in some way. Your instance of Windows desktop, remote terminal services, whatever you want to call it, remote desktop protocol, would have to have an exposure to the public. So that's unlikely if you're behind a router. On the other hand, we'll talk about in a second, there's a lot of those. So they said customers running Windows 8 and Windows 10 are not affected by this vulnerability, and it is no coincidence, this is them stroking themselves, that later versions of Windows are unaffected. Microsoft invests heavily in strengthening the security of its products. I would argue it's probably a coincidence.
Yeah,
anyway.
I find that hard to... we didn't fix it in any of the other versions, but we did fix it.
Given the fact that, what was it now? I don't have the number in front of me. 70-some... Oh, there it is. 79 vulnerabilities were fixed in Windows 10 this month. Again. So they said Microsoft invests heavily in strengthening the security of its products, often through major architectural improvements that are not possible to backport to earlier versions of Windows. There is partial mitigation, this is Microsoft, on affected systems that have network-level authentication, NLA, enabled. The affected systems are mitigated against wormable malware or advanced malware threats that could exploit the vulnerability, as NLA requires authentication before the vulnerability can be triggered. However, affected systems are still vulnerable to remote code execution exploitation if the attacker has valid credentials that can be used to successfully authenticate. Okay, so what that means is that we've been talking recently about all of these problems with RDP. I know I've said to our listeners over and over, there is no safe way to have this port 3389 publicly exposed. You just can't. I'm a big fan of remote desktop. It's super convenient. It's, Windows is inherently GUI by nature. So it wants GUI administration. Consequently, it's the way I remotely administer GRC's servers. But you will find no port 3389 or any other port listening on GRC's network that's got remote desktop protocol exposed. There is no possible safe way to have it exposed. So, RDP runs over a well-known port, 3389. So, not surprisingly, scanning the internet's IPv4 address space for instances of that port accepting TCP connections is trivial. Now get this, about 11 million 11 million IPv4 addresses are currently accepting connections on port 3389. And because people have looked more closely after their eyes bugged out, somewhere around 4.1 million of those IP addresses respond as RDP servers. Today, 4.1 million exposed RDP servers. That's insane, but it's the case. And it certainly explains and warrants Microsoft's deep concern when we absolutely know that some probably significant percentage of those will be XP, Windows 7, Server 2003, Server 2008, or Server 2008 R2 machines. So what we now know is that there is an exploit which will certainly be reverse engineered, which allows all of those 4.1 million RDP responding servers that are XP 7 or any of those servers responding, this exploit allows them to be taken over remotely. And if they happen to have NLA enabled, which is not the norm, but if they did, then even those that we've been talking about whose credentials have been brute forced can now have remote code execution leveraged against them in order to allow the attackers to get more than they were able to before. So although on the other hand, if you have a remote desktop protocol that gives the connector sufficient privileges, you've got effective remote code execution anyway, because you can send anything through that connection that you want to and then run it at the other end. So, okay, so just for the sake of our listeners, anyone who wishes, any individual or enterprise who wishes to make remote desktop protocol available remotely must simply place it behind a VPN. That's all you have to do. Install an instance of OpenVPN server using certificate-based authentication. Set up an instance of one or more instances of OpenVPN clients with authorized client machines, giving them individual certificates signed by the server's private key. Now you have a robust means of managing a set of VPN clients who you can then selectively give access to remote desktop protocol through the VPN. This unfortunately, I mean, it's almost unfortunate that there's even a password on remote desktop protocol, because if there weren't one, well, I guess I don't mean that, because people still would put it on the public internet and go, oh, well, I guess we're not supposed to password protect it. But the point is the password doesn't work, as we've seen, except on more recent versions of Windows. Now anybody can get to these things. So given that there are many millions of probably exploitable RDP servers that will probably not be updated, we're almost certainly going to see this. We'll be talking about this a month or two from now, that, the RDP worm that hit. To their credit, again, Microsoft did what they could. They offered a patch to old systems that are probably online, but as we have so often seen, probably not going to get patched, probably never going to get patched. And now they're going to get taken over as soon as some miscreants reverse engineer this problem, knowing, first of all, that there is a patch, looking at the patch, see what got changed. I mean, we have all the tools are in place. The skill set is in place. It's going to happen. So we don't know that they will create a worm. In this day and age, they'll probably just infect them with crypto miners, and hopefully that they're running powerful servers that they can use for mining cryptocurrency, and they'll just suck all of the CPU cycles out of those. or maybe they'll do a worm. The point was that Microsoft said it was wormable because it required absolutely no user interaction, just like WannaCry, where if it was able to get into a system, then it was able to do so autonomously, didn't require anything to then be able to turn around and start scanning for more vulnerable systems. Well, now we have Shodan, which is the way we know that there are 11 million open 3389 ports, and 4.1 of those respond to the remote desktop protocol. There's no question that a heavy percentage of those are going to be older machines that are not going to get patched. So we will likely be talking about, like the other shoe to drop on this one before long.